Well, I love the work I heard tonight from the students. But I decided I might read a little something, but I decided I would tell you a story. That's okay. And it's somewhat instructive about making fiction. This is a story that is something that happened to me. One of the rules of my workshops is students are not allowed to say, but it really happened. If they say, but it really happened in defense of a story, we collectively throw that student out through the window. I don't care if it happened. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I just can't hear those words. This is something that happened, and it ruined my life for 12 years. Every 6 months, I would try to turn this story into a work of fiction. Every 6 months, I would fail. Finally, I wrote it, published it, just so I would never have to think about it again. And this is the story. First of all, I have to introduce this place where this happened. It happened in Idaho. I used to work ranches in southern Idaho, and western Montana, and eastern Oregon. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Idaho, but I became known as the black guy by driving through Idaho. In fact, to give you an idea of what that part of the West is like, I was delivering cows to someone in Baker, Oregon. And as I parked the truck, and I had to find the man who owned the feedlot in town. And I stopped a woman and asked her where this address was. And she looked at me and she looked down the street. She said, "Yes, it's 3 blocks that way." To which I responded, "It can't be nearly that far." But I was hired to work on a ranch outside the town of Council, Idaho. Council probably had maybe 12 people in total. It was a ranching community. Ranch work is really boring. And I was the only black person for maybe a 1,000-mile radius, it seemed. But I was working this ranch, and there was one cowboy on the ranch who was really fascinated by me because I don't know if he'd ever seen a black person in his life, and he had a handlebar mustache. I'd never seen a handlebar mustache, so he was as freakish to me as I was to him, I guess. But he kept asking if I had Indian blood. And he said it in that cowboy way. He says, "You got any Indian blood in you?" And I said, "No." Finally one day, we were castrating bulls. I know that sounds bad, but it's better than having it be the other way around. And he came up, and I was cutting off parts and throwing them back on the fire while a man worked the squeeze gate. And he said, "You sure you ain't got no Indian blood in you?" To which I responded, "If you weren't so busy studying the ropes all the time, you could see that I'm black." I'd insulted his abilities as a cowboy. And a couple of guys standing on the fence line laughed, and he walked off in a huff. I went back to the bunkhouse. I was putting my clothes together, and again, I told you ranch work is really boring. I was going to go into the town of Council. I was going to do my laundry at the laundromat, watch a baseball game on television, and I don't like baseball, and I was excited to be going. I was putting my clothes into the bag, and in walked the cook. His name was Carol. Carol had one leg, and he walked with 2 crutches, the kind with the cuff and the handles, and he came in and asked me if I would be eating there that evening, and I said, "Well, no." He looked rather depressed, sad, and started to walk away, and he said, "Well, no one is." And I said, "Well, Carol, if no one's eating here, why don't you come into town with me?" And he said, "No, it's all right." I said, "Well, we could split the room. I'm just going to do my laundry and watch a game on TV." And he said, "Well, maybe I will." So Carol met me out at my truck. A brand new corduroy sport coat, jeans, leg pinned up. Carol was looking good. He got into my truck. We're driving into Council. The sun was coming through the windshield, somewhat blinding. And Carol was doing something in his lap with a rag. And I didn't know what he was doing, but it was my truck, so I paid closer attention. And Carol had his dentures out and was cleaning them. As a child, I was taught if you don't know what to say, don't say anything, so I said nothing. He put his teeth back into his face, and we continued on. We arrived in Council, And as we were checking in, we walked past a group of Belgian tourists, confused Belgian tourists, talking excitedly to each other in French, mainly asking, where the hell are we and how did we get here? And we checked into our room, which was right at the top of the stairs. I remember this rather vividly. We went out and had dinner and went to a tavern just 2 doors down from the little hotel that we had checked into. And we were shooting pool. We shot pool for a while. And Carol drank beer. And he shot pool with one of his crutches, making a pretense of chalking up the rubber tip. And he was really good until the beer started to take hold. And he started to grow somewhat unsteady on his leg. And I said, well, Carol, maybe it's time to stop drinking beer and sit down. Carol took this to mean it was time to sit down and start drinking whiskey. So Carol did. He started throwing them back, and he was pretty well gone, wasted. I think my students would say shit-faced. When Handlebar Mustache and another cowboy and a woman who had applied her makeup with a palette knife and put her jeans on and simply grown into them when she was 12, came into the tavern. And he saw us, and he made a beeline for us. And this is what he said. And as I remember it, it sounded somewhat eloquent, in that cowboy sort of way. But to me, and when I say it, it sounds like a lot of words. He said, I see you two fellas are so ugly you couldn't find anybody but each other to hang out with. Which I thought was basically true, and I had no quarrel with this. Carol, on the other hand, being either more or less inebriated than I thought, looked beyond him at the 2 people with whom he'd entered the bar and said, I see the same is true of you. At which point a shouting match ensued. And what possesses a 21-year-old idiot, moi, to stand between 2 grown men, 3 legs notwithstanding, who want to fight, I don't know. That's how I was positioned. It soon became clear that they were only going to bark at each other, and Carol made a strange noise. And I turned to him, and he turned a crimson color and passed out. I caught him over my shoulder, I grabbed his crutches, and carried him fireman style 2 doors down, past the Belgian tourist into the hotel. At least the Belgians now had something to put on their postcards, which was they saw the only black man in a 1,000-mile radius carrying a one-legged man up to his room. I carried him upstairs and I dumped him onto his bed rather unceremoniously, and went and sat at the window and looked out and thought what a great time I was having, when I heard a gurgling sound. I turned, because it wasn't me making the gurgling sound, and it was in fact coming from Carol. And I walked over, and you touch a lot of things when you work ranches, like blood, dung. I have reached into horses and cats and turned offspring around. His teeth had turned sideways in his mouth. And I became convinced and terrified that he would swallow said teeth, choke to death, and leave me, the only black man in a 1,000-mile radius, to explain to the crazy constable of Council, Idaho, his body. So I reached in, and it's a big deal reaching into someone else's mouth who is not your kid. But I reached into his mouth, extracted these teeth, slapped them on the nightstand, leaped over his bed, ran into the washroom, and disappeared in one of those pathetic wafers of soap they give you in motels. Came back, was satisfied that he was still alive, and tried to go to sleep. And in fact, I must have fallen asleep because I was awakened and startled by the sight of his teeth on the nightstand. I saw that he was still breathing, and I collected my clothes and left. Went to do my laundry that morning. I'll tell you it's a long story. While at the laundromat, I talked to a little Vauvan, a native girl whose mother was folding clothes at the other end of the room. And into the laundromat walked a man who was always on the streets of Council, no matter what the weather, freezing cold, burning hot, in a fatigue jacket. He walked in and wanted quarters, and he made the native woman uncomfortable. So I gave him some quarters and he left. I walked back to the hotel with my clothes, walked up the stairs, opened the door, and the curtains had been pulled off. the windows. The drapes were down. One mattress was completely off the bed, the other was askew, the covers were on the floor. And there was Carol hopping around in his underwear, his crutches leaning against the far wall. I had been to college by now, and I was able to deduce that something was wrong. So I said, well, Carol, what's wrong? And he said, oh, I can't find my teeth. Now, mind you, there's a man who consumed milk directly from its source, if you know what I mean, on a dare. And I told him I had to reach into his mouth to get his teeth, and he looked like he was going to faint. He stepped back and sat down. And he said, well, I can't find them. And I said, I put them on the nightstand. I walked over to the nightstand, and in fact, they were not on the nightstand. I looked on the floor. I looked under the beds. I looked behind the carpeting, behind the nightstand against the wall. I said, I put them right here. And here is where this man said something that ruined my life for 12 years. He looked me right in the eye and said this: my grinners, somebody done stole my grinners. I thought, God, that's beautiful. In my head, I thought that. What my mouth said was, I'll look outside. And so I went outside. I closed the door and I stood in the hallway. I thought, well, what the hell? And then I realized, I told him I'd look outside, so I should go outside. And I went outside. And I was leaning against the wall outside, wondering how long one pretends to look for teeth in the street. When the man from the laundromat came walking up to me. And he said something. I didn't understand what he was saying, but that was not unusual, as I never understood what he was saying. But he sounded different nonetheless. And I said, say something else. And into his hand he spat teeth. And I said, where'd you get those? And he said, bought them off this fella. And I said, well, how much did you pay? And he said, paid $1. I said, I will give you $5 for them. And he said, they don't fit no way. And he put them into my hand. I ran through the lobby into the lavatory downstairs next to the clerk's desk. And I remember this washroom very well. It was three sinks, one shared mirror, a metal sill, and 2 stalls. I parked myself in front of the middle sink, and I was washing my hands maniacally, when out of one of the stalls stepped one of the Belgians. He stepped up to the sink, was washing his hand. He looked at me in the mirror. I looked at him. He smiled. I smiled. But there were teeth on the sill, so they weren't my teeth. He sprinted out of the bathroom, because obviously the only black man in a 1,000-mile radius was killing people and stealing their prosthetic devices. I collected the teeth in a nest of paper towels, carried them up the stairs, opened the door, and presented them, again rather unceremoniously, to Carol. I think I said, here are your damn teeth. And then he asked a rather reasonable question, which was, where were they? And as I considered making this a story years on, I thought, well, maybe this is my moral dilemma. But I had no dilemma at all. What I said was, they were on the curb. I lied. I said, they were on the curb, damnedest thing you've ever seen. And he said, but obviously that's not a satisfying answer, but that was all he was getting from me. He took them to the washroom and rinsed them off rather cursorily for my taste, and put them into his face, and came back and said the only thing I think he could have said that would have scared me. He said, they feel funny. And I thought, oh my God, they're not his teeth. And a man ought to know his own teeth. I mean, wouldn't you? I didn't know anything about dentures. And so we never said another word about it. I assumed that Handlebar Mustache had come in and this is his idea of a joke. But as the years went on, I could tell the story. It's an amusing story. It's somewhat funny. But I could not make it work as a short story. And there's a reason for that. I am an artist. I make fiction. I don't report the world. I have to create it. I love all the details of this story so much that I couldn't be free to do my job. I was handcuffed by the truth. But more importantly, I had to understand that I was handcuffed not by the truth, but by the facts. I couldn't render anything true because all I could do was report this. So that's my object lesson for writing fiction. And to end this, I will read a very short section in my last novel, which is titled Percival Everett by Virgil Russell, though I do not appear in the novel. And this part is called The Second Face of Desire. Lying here like this, I have learned some things about us, and learned nothing at all. And it is the nothing at all that sings to me in this cucumbery trance, that we may choose to assume, that as any given state of affairs is upset, that there arises an instinct to make them anew. And as we set about, we entertain all these words, all these thoughts, notions, utterances, calculations, equations, texts, all of this. And language remains always a step ahead of us. And we think this most clearly as we die, a step, 2 steps ahead of us. Our speaking, our writing, our groping always lags behind language. Far enough that there is nothing to say about language itself, as we cannot look directly upon its magnificence. Like simile and Zeus, burn, baby, burn, and yet a Hegelian desire, a Freudian instinct. No matter how we yak, how much we talk about ourselves in words and text, all we ever do is circle where we think language might reside. Guessing like we guess about the location of electrons, about positrons and pions, and muons and kaons and leptons and quarks and imaginary ducks, using it without pause, without thought, knowing that we cannot live without it, and that we define ourselves with it and by it, but it is not ours. It found us, waited for us to find it. We evolve to find it waiting, and we explore its structure, the structure we impose. Believe we add to its content daily, recognize its terms, its fluidity, its features, its alterability, and yet we cannot account for it, explain it, find the egg of it, because it is, in short, God, the only God that we know or will know or have known, it being immaterial, without form or mass or weight or constituent parts, the identification of parts of speech being little more than an exercise in question begging. Like describing judgments by examples of things judged, and it's completely dependent on us, and yet we give it nothing, just as digging more ditch makes the ditch no more a ditch. And it dies every day, and yet continues to lives in units that we cannot see or hear, so big that we cannot miss them, and we can represent none of them, as it exists without senses, without medium, without intention, without reflection or deflection, but not without us, as it makes us human, forces us to be human, reminds us to be human, yet has no feeling toward us, gives us life, conflict, confusion, war, and understanding. And it is all-powerful and without judgments, and it can state its own apparent inadequacy and then overcome it, revealing that we are the site of the failure. Create context, is not the sum of its parts, and we cannot imagine the whole of it, cannot imagine it at all. And it creates gods for us to pray to, gods for us to fear and love, creates religions, and then refutes them, creates a way for us to talk about the unknown, about language itself, and yet does not create itself, is not created, just is. And we cannot imagine ourselves without it, cannot imagine without it, because it is God, and it lets us know that God is just a word, that God is just a grammar, that its grammar is just our feeble construct to approach its radiance. It has nothing to do with text, it has nothing to do with words, and probably has nothing to do with our thoughts. And the things we think we know nothing when we know there is nothing, and nothing is our last safe cave of language. And vegetable me, the skies and the river, the moons and the sea. The birds speak in riddles, and dolphins tell lies. They will all live forever, and nobody dies. Thank you. I'm supposed to answer questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
I'm supposed to stand up and introduce myself. I'm Professor Christensen from Florida Memorial University. This is our group. You had spoken earlier today about process, and I kind of told you I'd come back to it so that my students could hear what you had to say about the first draft and revision, how you go through that, and what your writing process sort of is.
Well, I hope I get the same answer, so I'm not accused of being duplicitous. I think my relationship with revision has changed over the years, but it's still essentially the same, and that is revision is writing. When I start a story, as everyone, I have no idea what I'm doing. And it's kind of magic. You start with a blank piece of paper, and at the end of this, you end up with 15, 20 pages full of words that weren't there before. Unlike painters who go out and buy tubes of paint, or musicians who have something to blow through, you're using something that's completely abstract, filling a page with the sounds we make. You don't know what you're doing when you start. When you get to the middle, you have some idea of what you're doing. When you get to the end, you kind of know the story. So you go back to the beginning to fix what you didn't know, which changes the middle, which again changes the end. And then one has a first draft. Then you have to start to work on it. If you haven't done anything yet, just offered up a story. Now you have to turn it into a work of art. And that means looking at it, seeing if it works, making decisions about language, about person, about setting, place. And it's not unusual to write a story 10, 12 times. The same is true of a poem. A lot of people think that poets spend more time on lines than fiction writers. If they do, then the fiction writer's not doing it correctly. Every word, every line does work. And so as a fiction writer, you have to pay attention to every line. And there's no shortcut for that. It's labor intensive. I often get jealous of my friends who teach poetry because they go home with their folders. You know, it takes a long time to write a poem, but they carry what they have to read home in a folder. I need a wheelbarrow. It's a lot of pages. And sadly, I always thought that using a computer would use less paper. Well, that's not true. And I write everything longhand. And I do this for one reason. I encourage my students to do it. I write longhand because of the delete key on your keyboard. When you don't like something when you're writing on a computer, you press that key and you erase it. And it's gone forever. When I write longhand, I scratch it out, and it's still there. And often, it's what I wanted, what I needed in the first place. So, that's one thing. And the other thing is just, writing fiction is labor intensive. It takes a lot of time, and you just have to realize that. And I have a friend in New York, and he works a day job. I can't remember what he does. I think he might be a computer programmer or something. But he really wants to write fiction. He wakes up at 5 in the morning and goes down into the laundry room of his building and works for 3 hours every morning. I'm impressed by that. That's dedication, and that's what it requires, that kind of dedication.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Courtney Wright. I'm from Florida Memorial University. I'm a junior. I'm an English major. My question is, when introducing a new character in a story, how do you determine what is too much or too little information about the character so that they will not overpower the main characters?
Sometimes you don't know. I don't think I've ever had that happen. Often a character comes into a story that's unexpected. You think, wow, this is a good character. And sometimes you take that character and say, you're going to get your own story. You just move that character out. But you just have to find the rhythm of the story, and you're always editing. It's always better to write too much than too little. It's a lot easier to cut stuff out than it is to plug stuff in. But I don't have a quick answer to that.
Question? Over here.
There's one in the back, too.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lorenzo Palma from Florida Memorial University, education English major. My question is, the title of the novel is I Am Not Sidney Poitier, but the last words of the novel ends with I am not myself today. And then throughout the text, his whole identity begins to change because he refers to himself as Poitier, then I am not. So my question is there a point in the story where he ever accepts his true identity, or does he die from who he is and becomes Sidney Poitier?
Sure, why not? One of the beautiful things about, again, art is that as the artist, I'm not the end of the circuit. The circuit is completed, my work, by the reader. Meaning gets made by you. I'm not important. Once I let it go, it's whatever you decide it is. And that's for two reasons, as I said earlier. One is, I don't know enough to tell you. Well, three. The other is, I've forgotten all of it. And the third is, I really don't matter. And any writer who becomes invested in it, meaning what they think it means, is either a megalomaniacal fool or on drugs. And many writers are on drugs. So and that's the beautiful part of it. You're reading, everyone else's readings. I get to hear all these different ideas about what my novels mean. And I think, wow. And I always say, yes, of course I meant that, even when I have no idea what they're talking about, because it's true.
Hello, my name is Jeremiah Carter. I'm a communications major. And I'm reading this book in my African Lit class. And it's a very interesting book. I actually enjoy it. And I just want to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I put my bills on my desk. And that's really a lot of motivation. Again, it's making this stuff is magic. I don't know. I mean, I just finished a novel last week. I just sent it off to my agent, and now I have nothing to work on. It may well be that, and this is how I always feel, that I'll never work on anything else again. I feel this after I finish everything, because I don't know where this stuff comes from. Again, you start with blank pages, and all of a sudden you write a sentence, and you write another sentence. And 400 pages later, you think, does my family still love me? Mm-hmm. Because you've been removed from them. You enter into this world. And you just make this shit up.
Any more questions?
Hello, my name is Karen Duarte. I'm a dual enrollment student at BC. And my question is, in your novel, I'm Not Sidney Poitier, is there a specific reason why the characters sometimes go off topic, like in their conversation? Like, they just come up with they'll start saying random stuff, or...
How come nobody asked me questions about horses? Oh, I just did it. I didn't say it. No, as my students will tell you, I will do that all the time. And sometimes I have in mind some sort of strange metaphor for them. And sometimes I just I'm more interested in something else. And I like non sequiturs. And here's a very strange non sequitur that's not a non sequitur. In the middle of a novel, I do have a line that says, there is no such thing as a non sequitur. And what I love about that is that as soon as I say it, the non sequitur is not a non sequitur. No, my humor was shaped by Mark Twain, Groucho Marx, and I don't know if many people remember Bullwinkle. And it's full of non sequitur.
Any more questions? No. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Everett.
Hi.
My name is Vanina Vera. I'm studying in DC in the paralegal program. And for us, including my class, it was a joy to read your book. And I'm a Christian, and the reason I'm saying this is because I was shocked by the first chapters about being pregnant 2 years, and Mr. Nat Sidney was having blowjobs every now and then. So, but I think it was brilliant the way that you touched education and religion, and in such a way that we all can be part of what you were trying to say in your novel. But as I said, as a paralegal program, there was something that I was curious about, and is about that is. Or you're gonna let me just get my own conclusion about the philosophy of nonsense regarding to the Mr. Nat Sidney having all those blowjobs.
Oh.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Oh, okay. Just I wanted to know, because it was so brilliant the way that you wrote about racism, about the black people being racist. The nuns, crazy nuns, singing, touching the religion subject. So I said, there is something here just more. It has to be something maybe different to spice things up in the novel. And I just would like to give you the chance to explain that, if it is a kind. Or I thought maybe it's just something to relate it to the philosophy of nonsense. And I also like to compliment you in the way that you playfully introduce yourself in the novel. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed the book. I guess you can all continue.
I didn't know I'd be talking about blowjobs. Well, blowjobs happen. That's all I can say. It happens.
Questions?
Hello, my name is Jared Simpson. My major is sociology. I did a little research on you for my class project, and I read somewhere that you do not like to be classified as a black writer, as an African American writer. Do you feel in this day and age, race and gender still plays a part in even the creative writing field or in the writing field in general?
Well, it shouldn't, but it probably does sometimes. The reason I don't like that assignation is by creating that category, you logically create the conception that there's something called mainstream writing, and there is not. I would be completely happy if I walked into Barnes and Nobles or some other bookstore and saw African American, Native American, and white American fiction. But there is no white American section. So one can only come to the conclusion that there is the standard, acceptable art, white American, and then there are these ancillary or marginalized categories of art. And that's just not true. So in the world, and that's not how anyone exists. As soon as you said this about someone, you've cheated them out of the complexity of their existence. A black person living in Wyoming is not the same black person that lives in Harlem. Is not the same black person that lives in Tallahassee. Is not the same black person that lives in Seattle. They have different experiences with geography, with religion, with language, with the landscape. And their differences are as varied, their experiences are as varied and different as those of white Americans from each other. Yes.
Thank you again for being here. You listened to our student writers tonight, and I was thinking back to your story today that you told of teaching a graduate workshop and having this author of Graceland in your class, and your little tiny contribution being to give him the self-slap whenever he was getting too lyrical or poetic in his fiction. Having heard representative writers here, if you were to walk into their class, what little contribution would you make to these beginning writers, beginning creative writers?
And the people I heard today, I'd leave them alone.
Awesome. We have one more question. Uno más.
Mr. Fast. Go ahead, student.
Good evening, one and all. My name is Godfrey Joseph, an IT major. Please forgive my ignorance of your works of art. But I will say this, I really do appreciate your candor and your sense of humor. And have you or will you think about doing a series of books, I should say, and in terms of a writing process, how would you just spitballing it? How would you end one to start into another? Because that's always been my personal issue in terms of transition from one idea to another.
I've never considered a series of books. I consider all of my novels to be a part of a single work, but they're not connected in any sort of serial fashion. And as far as I know, there may be characters who have shown up in a couple of stories, but they're all completely separate and distinct works.
Dr. Nessie, would you like to say something?
I just had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Everett. I know our students really enjoyed the work, and I enjoyed the book. I found it very interesting. I was wondering about research. I know writers, are you reading about your work as you're constructing it? I wasn't here at the earlier session, maybe you addressed that, or are you just kind of reading anything you want, or are you kind of doing a purposeful type of research as you're constructing your novel?
My work is terribly research heavy. I have a novel about a hydrologist, but I knew nothing about hydrology, so I read 25 or 6 books on geomorphology and hydrology, and then did 3 months of field work with a hydrologist before I started writing a novel about an obstetrician. And for 3 years I read medical journals. And it's not to become a doctor or become a hydrologist, but I need to know enough to create the world of my characters without it appearing as if I've done the research. I want it to be a part of my language and the way I think about things. In fact, with the hydrologist, I wanted him to know more about this particular landscape, a particular landscape, than anyone else. Since I cannot know, though I know a lot of places very well, more than anyone else about any place, I drew bogus topological maps of a place, and no one else could know more about it because I made it up, and wrote hydrologic reports about that place. They actually appeared in the novel. Then there are some novels where, because I trained horses for 12 years, I ranched. I knew I could use what I know about horse training and ranches to do it. For I Am Not Sidney Poitier, I had to watch, a lot of the younger readers probably can't see that there are 8, maybe 9 films of Sidney Poitier's retold in the novel in varying ways. And so I never was a big fan of Sidney Poitier. I always found him to be sort of somewhat of a wooden actor. I always liked him as a figure, but didn't like his acting. But I decided to use him, and so I had to watch these movies 50 times so that I could retell the stories without retelling. I had to own the material. And likewise, I have a novel about the Greek god Dionysus. I read Euripides' Bacchae over and over, 23 different translations, until I finally I did my own translation from Greek, and it was the worst of all ones I read, but it allowed me to own the material and recreate the story. So, yeah, and that's fun. That's why I write, so I can study something.
Before we end tonight, I want to thank, on behalf of the English department and the Writes Spring team, our academic dean, Señora or Señorita? Señora Delgado, thank you so much.